Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, @mail, MAIL, .wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening. COVID-19 vaccines are available to West Virginians in all 55 counties. To find COVID-19 vaccines near you, visit vaccinate.wv.gov. You can also call the West Virginia COVID-19 info line at 1-833-793-0965. Again, that's vaccinate.wv.gov or 1-833-793-0965 to find your COVID-19 vaccine.
Lamb is a growing consumer item.
Right, Karen. And did you know that I actually got a couple lambs in my freezer? Just some ground lamb. I like ground lamb every once in a while.
Lamb is fantastic. In fact, my son discovered the taste of lamb over this past week, and he now says it's his favorite food. It's something that can be grown on a smaller patch of land than cattle could. So if you do have a smaller farm and are looking to get into some meat animals, try looking into some lamb as far as the meat versions and see what you can do with them. I know there are markets available for that.
That's right. And you can do those grass-fed or even a feedlot type situation where you can put the lambs in your barn and have a perfectly good operation with a low footprint as far as space goes.
That's right. They're little creatures there. All right. So as far as little creatures, we're going to talk a little bit more today about the littlest creatures that are working on your farm. And that is the microorganisms and the worms and the nematodes and all of those lovely little things that are working each and every day to make sure you have good soil quality. So we're going to talk a little bit about mulch and how you feed those little critters.
Yeah, I was wondering where you were going with that. I thought we were going to talk about parasites. We were talking about lambs earlier and sheep, right?
We'll save parasites for another day, but that's a good topic. We should definitely cover that.
That's right. Yeah, and I think past couple of weeks we also talked a lot about mud. Yeah, so still muddy out there, but let's shift gears and go into some mulch.
Yeah, and actually mulch is one of the things you can do to help alleviate some moisture problems, especially in a garden type environment or even a crop field, because some mulches definitely are not crop field material, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But there are some mulches that you can use on those broader scales to help alleviate water issues. And mulch actually will help when there's not enough water as well, too. So
that's right. And now is a good time to do some mulching. But let's start from the beginning and talk about mulch. You know, a lot of people think that mulch is a new concept, kind of like, I think it was something else. Pests are a new concept. There's new ones all the time, but they've been around for a long time. But mulch has also been around for a long time. And it comes from a German word, which I know you were just in Germany, Mulch, meaning soft, beginning to decay. So when we talk about mulch, most people think wood mulch, but there's so many different kinds of mulch out there. There's bark, so there's tree bark, there's chipped wood, there's plastic mulch. There are certain geotextiles now that have actually, those are newer types of mulch. But the concept of mulching is old. And, you know, if we think about how we see mulching, can't even talk either, must be the day. If we think about mulching in nature, think about the leaves falling off trees. You know, forests have been mulching themselves for a long time. And what happens if you cut down trees and leave bare soil? You lose that soil, right? So in a way, if you think about protecting soil, which is one of the great uses for mulch, one of the things we're going to be talking about, but nature has been doing that to protect its soil in forested areas.
And farmers have been doing it for ages as well. It wasn't until World War II and the introduction of chemical-based soil fertilizers where because they didn't have room for as many animals, and so they had to reduce the animals. They had less manure, so they needed a different type of fertilizer to use. And so, but prior to that, mulching was a standard farm practice. So it wasn't until the Green Revolution, so to speak, we kind of got away from mulching, and we've started to see where we have left some pretty barren soils behind because of our not giving back to the soil. So mulching is a great way to give back to the soil. And so, like Dan was saying, there's a lot of different types of mulches. There are tree-based mulches, and there are green mulches, and there are the plastic mulches. And so, so let's talk about the benefits. And did you want to cover anything else about why you should mulch before we get into that?
Yeah, so now is a good time to mulch, and let's talk about why it's a good time to mulch certain things. A lot of people have a lot of brassicas out, or they're just finishing their harvest. Maybe they have some perennials, so your perennial shrubs that are going to come back next year. So mulching is a good insulator. So in this case, what we're trying to do is prevent the ground from getting too cold too fast. So we're giving those roots time to harden. We're giving them according to some of my sources here, you can reduce temperatures or increase temperatures depending on whether it's summer mulching or winter mulching, because it's an insulator, right? So it's either going to keep it cool or keep it warmer. In this case, we're keeping it warmer because the ground is the heat's coming up, and the temperature on the outside is colder. So the mulch will insulate it and keep it warmer. So up to 8 to 10 degrees. And if you think about certain temperatures that are winter, or I won't say cold sensitive, like sometimes you just want to plant something that's right there on the cusp of the temperature range of where you are. Mulch might be a good way to kind of get some extra safety.
Yeah, and so mulch can be protective for a lot of our landscape plants, our roses, if you have canna lilies, if you have, sometimes depending on where you are, if you have a plant that's on that border zone, you can just layer it in mulch instead of having to dig it up and store it over the winter inside of a cool, dark area. But definitely make sure that you've looked into it if it's a very valuable plant that you don't want to lose. Make sure you know before you plant it what type of labor is going to be involved in. But sometimes, just taking all those leaves that the tree so graciously gives you at the end of the year and piling them up on your flower garden can do a lot of great things. One thing you do have to be careful about when using leaf mulch, and this is something that could be an issue with rhododendrons, if you have had rhododendron leaf drop where that's been affected by a fungal disease, you want to get those leaves out of there before you just pile new leaves on. So take the rhododendron leaves out that have that disease on them and get rid of those, bag them up and throw them away. And then take your oak leaves or whatever and put them underneath of the rhododendron. So you, just like in composting, you want to make sure you're not mulching with any diseased materials. And so definitely, take a look around before you start mulching and say, okay, I do have a disease issue with this tree or this plant, so I'm going to pull out all of those leaves and destroy them, get rid of them, and then I'll put some fresh mulch down of whatever type you're interested in putting down. That was definitely going to be a helpful thing for you.
Yeah. And so Karen, that is a great point. So mulching can be something aesthetically pleasing. It can keep the weeds down. You don't necessarily have to use leaves to mulch just because you have them. What you were saying about composting, that's another great practice that you can use as well. And if you remember I'm sure we've talked about this before, but the ideal carbon to nitrogen ratio, I know I'm getting a little off topic here, but if you think about leaves are 60 to 1, 60 carbon to 1 part nitrogen, right? So they're very high in carbon. So if you are composting with leaves, you're going to have to put something that's higher in nitrogen. So if you mix leaves, let's say with food waste, that's 15 to 1. If you go about 50-50, you can get to that 30 to 1 ratio and get a pretty good compost from leaves. So a lot of people don't like to see leaves as a compost because of, just the way it looks. Let's say it's in the if they say they're doing their shrubs, rhododendron, but they can compost it and get some really good compost out of it.
Yeah, and if you want to take it a step further, instead of raking all those leaves up, use your lawnmower and just chop them up and feed them back to your lawn, and you'll have a healthier lawn as a result of it. Or if your lawn's tall enough, you can, and you have a bagger, then you can bag up the leaves with the lawn clippings and get your nice ratio. Really easy. Yeah. So, all right.
So many options.
So many options. So another thing you want to make sure you're keeping in mind about using these organic mulches as far as a late season mulch is that you're not putting it on too early. So you want to make sure you have at least 2 good freezes that make sure that the plants have hardened off for the winter. Otherwise, you're just going to be kind of like giving them a little blanket, making them think it's warmer than it actually is, and they won't harden off properly. So you do want to make sure before you put your late season mulch on that you are giving the plants an opportunity to harden off.
Great point. And also, a lot of times I know that once you're out there, you like to do everything and some. So don't fertilize if you're mulching either, because as Karen said, just fertilizer will also kind of stimulate that growth. And if it grows, especially your roses, you shouldn't actually fertilize your roses after July, because that let the plant use what it has. And then as it cools down, the plant will slowly harden. Otherwise, it won't survive the winter. If you give them nitrogen now, if you're giving them warm soil, they're just going to grow and they're going to die.
Yeah, and that's really important too. And, my personal opinion is if it's a woody plant, you shouldn't fertilize it at all. But I know that I'm in the minority when it comes to roses. So, if you, I feel that if you're managing your soil correctly by feeding your soil with a good mulch every year, that you shouldn't need to use a whole lot of fertilizer with woody plants. But also keep in mind whenever you're removing something, if you're harvesting those petals and taking them in the house, taking the rose hips off and not allowing that to decompose back into the soil, then you are removing something and you're taking out of that cycle. And you do need to give back at that point. All right. So what are some characteristics of a good mulch?
Okay. Yeah. And so, we're talking about how mulch is going to be an insulator, right? So you don't want to keep it year round, because sometimes you want the soil to warm up, right? So a good mulch is going to be economical. It's going to be easily available. So you're not going to spend a whole lot of money. It's not going to be hard to get. And it's going to be easily removed. And that's the part that a lot of people forget. Mulching, if you want to use mulching as it was intended to be used in terms of increasing your plant health and increasing your garden's capability, then you want to use it as an insulator. So you're protecting the plants in the wintertime. And then as it warms up, you want it easily removed because you want to pull it back. You want to maybe, at that point in the spring when things start growing again, that's when you want to fertilize, get the growth going. And then you want to make sure that soil heats up. And since we're talking roses now, roses like a cooler root system, so they don't do well in that July, August heat. So putting that mulch later in the spring or even in the summertime, what that'll do is that'll drop the temperature of drop the temperature of the soil where the roots are growing, and that'll keep the roses growing even nicer throughout summer into fall. So a good mulch is going to be something that you can remove and also bring back. You want to make sure, as Karen was saying, that they're free of noxious weeds, insects, diseases. Remember, anything that you have disease, you just burn. You don't even want to compost. That heat might not kill everything, especially fungal spores, and you can lose your rhododendron through what were those leaves that you're talking about? Oak leaves were good, but the maple leaves, I believe.
You mean as far as like the acid content for the rhododendron?
The fungal disease that you're talking
about. For the rhododendron leaves itself.
Oh, okay.
So the leaves that the plant, say if you have a plant that's dropping leaves, it could be a dogwood or a rhododendron, anything. You're basically maintaining, just like you remove your tomato plants at the end of the season. Right. Okay. You want to remove any dead material from your plant area and put back something that's healthy and clean into that area. So it's the same basic concept you use in your vegetable garden. But Yeah, so it all depends on what you're, trying to do and what you need to take care of.
Yeah. I think I misunderstood you there for a second.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah. So, other characteristics of a good mulch, everyone wants like that perfect mulch, that super mulch. And,
like the fungus mulch or whatever, the mushroom mulch. Yeah. I mean, there's no miracle. There's no miracle in agriculture.
Oh, come on, man.
Well, I mean, all right, maybe not miracle. Miracle's the wrong word. There's no easy bullet.
Yeah, there's nothing that's going to work for all situations, I think is where you're going with that. Yes. So, the type of mulch that you use is going to be based on what you need out of the mulch. Do you need it to feed the soil? Do you need it to be aesthetically pleasing? Do you need it to prevent weeds? You want to think about why you're putting this mulch down. A lot of people just put mulch down because it's what they've always done. Well, maybe you're putting down the wrong mulch for your ultimate goals. If you're looking for something to help you start some seeds, you use a thin layer of sawdust for that. But if you use more sawdust than a really thin layer, you need to make sure you're adding some nitrogen in with that, because it's about wood mulch especially. It takes 3 years before you get a nitrogen balance in that wood mulch. So you have to put on the same amount of wood mulch for 3 consecutive years before it stops stealing nitrogen from your soil. So if you're putting a wood mulch down or a sawdust down, you want to make sure that you're adding a little bit of nitrogen with it. Let's see, I think I have the numbers here.
How about this one?
Anyway, so you want to make sure that you're putting down some nitrogen with it so that you are not encouraging what you're trying to do to help your plants.
So you're not binding those nutrients.
Right.
So the fungus and the bacteria are going to use the same nutrients as the plant to break down that wood mulch. Because wood to the mushroom is to the fungus. I mean, that's going to be food, and to break down that food, it's going to need the nutrients that the plant also uses to make its own food. In this case, So one thing that I did kind of want to touch on that Karen just briefly mentioned, reseedings, right? So when you're doing something superficial, something that's very shallow seeding, so you have a really small seed and you just put it on there. If you have a lot of sawdust on there, sawdust has a lot of surface area and it breaks down quicker, which means like all those nutrients are bound faster. And if there's a lot of contact between the sawdust and the soil, and that seed's very superficial, that seed's not going to be able to get a lot of nutrients. So what's recommended typically is something like straw. Straw doesn't break down as quick, and it's very light material, so you can so it doesn't interact with the soil, holds the soil in place, which is something that we really didn't touch on. But mulching does reduce erosion. So for shallow seedings, usually straw is a good bet.
Yeah, straw is great, and it's what you most commonly see when people are reseeding their lawns. The biggest mistake I see people make when using straw as a mulch for a reseeding operation is that they put too much down. You really want to still see 50% of your soil surface area when you're reseeding a lawn. So just sprinkle the straw around so that you're still seeing some dirt through it, because what that straw is there for is really just a moisture control. Mulch is extremely great for absorbing extra moisture and also maintaining moisture. So seeds and plants like even moisture. They don't want to dry out unless they're a cactus, and they don't want to stay wet unless they're a mangrove. Of course, there's always eccentric plants in nature. And so you want to make sure that you're keeping that moisture content steady to make your seeds happy. And that's why you mulch for a new lawn or something like that, because you want to keep that moisture level even. And so for smaller, fast decomposing mulches, something that is cheap, sawdust and straw are really good for those things. If you want something that's going to stick around a little bit longer, you're going to either go with a bigger mulch, like say a bark mulch or a wood chip mulch, or maybe try to go to a stone mulch. But let's talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of like bark mulch versus wood chips.
Yeah, and I know a lot of gardeners do like the look of bark. And my understanding, and now I'm sitting next to the tree expert, so I might say something that's a little bit off, but she'll correct me if I am.
I will.
But if you think about a tree sitting in a field, the part of the tree that's generally really protected is where the bark is. The bark is a protectant layer for the tree. So usually what people will say is that bark mulch will hold up longer than wood chips because it does have all those chemicals that are exuded in the bark just to give it that protectant, maybe some water resistant qualities. But more usually what they'll say is that bark mulch is a little bit more durable than wood chips.
Yeah, and oftentimes also when you get bark mulch, it's typically in larger, flatter chunks too. It's usually not as finely ground as chip mulch. So yeah, I would say your bark mulch is going to last the longest probably of all of your natural mulches.
Unless you use lava stone.
Of your organic mulches.
You said natural.
Of your organic mulches, yes. Thank you for that. But yeah, so, bark mulch is good. Now, one of the things I will caution you is to go back to the disease factor is when you are putting mulch around a specific kind of tree, you don't want to mulch it with the same kind of tree. So if you have a pine tree, you don't want to put pine bark mulch under it or pine straw needles under it because those have been brought in from another location and they may have a disease from that area that you're bringing into your pine tree and putting that disease vector right next to a susceptible host. So try to avoid that. So if you have a pine tree, use hardwood mulch. If you have a hardwood, use pine mulch. And that will usually break up that disease cycle side of the triangle.
Yeah, and pine needles. A lot of people like pine needles. But one thing that you have to understand about pine needles is that they typically acidify. And with the acidity, some plants like it, some plants don't. So if you have things that do like more of an acidic type environment, roses like a little bit more acidic environment. Blueberries definitely. And there's all the rhododendrons, I think, as well, right? So mulching with something with needles, with pine needles, that would be a nice thing to add in addition to the look, because a lot of people do like the look of needles.
Yeah, and they're softer, and especially the type of pine needle. So, and the thing with pine needles is if you are in an area where it's available, it's usually really cheap. If you are not in an area where it's readily available, it's usually fairly expensive. So again, it's going to be locally based as to whether or not that's a valid option for you. And let's see here, for your wood chips, if you have, say, a rain garden, you're going to go for the wood chips over the bark simply because bark floats. And so if you ever get a rainstorm, all of that mulch you put down is going to lift up and float down the road, and it's not going to stay in your wet zone where you want to keep it.
That's a good point. Yeah, especially lately here. I think if you're in a wet zone, you know that you're in a wet zone. I got drainage tile, like actually in my backyard, just, because it has such a low lying area in St. Clairsville, that normally drains great, but I'm telling you, it's a swamp. It is a swamp. The deer seem to like it, but that's about it. Lawnmower doesn't like it at all.
Yeah. Yeah. So to go back a little bit to other tree parts and talk about leaves a little more, you're looking at, if you're using them as an insulative layer, you want 2 to 3 inches thickness after they've been compacted down, and that's going to give you good annual weed control. But because they are so good at weed control by forming those interlocking layers, they're also going to keep your plants from coming up. So if you put them over top of your daffodils and you don't remove them in time in the spring, your daffodils are going to get smothered underneath of the leaves. And if you don't, you might see them lift up the leaves a little bit and you pull it off and they're that pale, sickly yellow color. Well, that's because they've been trying to grow for a long time, but you were a little slow. And I am definitely not ever guilty of that.
Right. And then in that yellow color is actually a precursor of chlorophyll, because most plants, unless it's something primitive like moss, will not green until it sees light. So, you're talking about the white asparagus, those are just kind of grown in the dark a lot of times, or sometimes it's just a mutant. But a lot of times when you see something that's been kind of growing under things, they're just that yellow color because they haven't seen light to start photosynthesizing.
That's right. Yeah, they need the light, definitely. And, let's talk about grass clippings a little bit while we're talking about green things before we run out of time. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not grass clippings are good to put on a garden. Oh, is it going to burn my tomatoes and whatnot? Grass clippings are actually really good. They're a high nitrogen source. They're a good feed source. But again, you want to make sure that your grass clippings aren't bringing something else in with it, like weed seeds. So typically, I would recommend composting your grass clippings before putting them on the garden, simply to reduce the weed issues.
Yeah, and also remember that if you're cutting grass with a lot of seed heads on it, you're bringing in a lot of those seeds. But yeah, weeds are year-round.
Yeah, and also make sure if you use a lawn treatment with an herbicide, a broadleaf herbicide, that you're not putting those grass clippings on your garden and spreading that broadleaf herbicide into your vegetables.
Right. And then just one last thing before we wrap up here. Really important to make sure that if you have a lot of wood chips and everything, and just you remove it, let's say, but then when you're going to put it back and you start mixing it with the soil, that's a really bad idea. You don't want to actually bury sawdust or wood chips into the soil because of those nutrient binding properties. If it's down by the roots, that's a direct competition.
That's right. And that's a great point. And with that, we will end our show for today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope to have you back next time.
COVID-19 vaccines have been safely administered to hundreds of millions of Americans, including myself. COVID-19 vaccination greatly reduces the risk of severe illness, hospitalization, and even death. The nation's top medical and healthcare experts agree that COVID-19 vaccines are our strongest tool to help stop the pandemic. So learn more at vaccinate.wv.gov or call 1-833-793-0965. Again, that's 1-833-793-0965. And please, get vaccinated. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.